So welcome along to this video. Now you've come to this video today because either you're looking at a new build, you want some information on a new build, advantages, and maybe if there are pitfalls about new builds, which there are. So what we're trying to do today, we're going to educate you a little on things to look out for, or what's really going to enhance maybe your portfolio that you're trying to build at the moment. With me today I have Matthew Gilligan from Gilligan Rowan Associates. Hello Matthew.
How are you, Mark?
And I got Matthew along because one, he's very, very experienced in property, owns a lot of property himself. He has an accountancy firm that specialises in property, and it's good to have a chat like this with someone else with a lot of wisdom in this, and he's been through different markets, creating new builds as well as buying new builds. So he's a good person to have sitting beside me talking to you today. So before we even start, what is a new build? We're talking about off-the-plan apartments or townhouses, and many of you might be looking at that right now, and that's why you're here, as I said. Buying a section and building a new place, or buying a land and home package. So that's really what we're talking about and discussing in today's video. So let's talk about the advantages to start off with, and we'll do the good first. And see if we can educate you in some way. So one thing is, especially right now, one of the reasons we're doing this at Property Ventures is when the new LVR rules come in last year and investors had to put 40% into property, that stopped a lot of people, in particular newer investors. So with new builds generally, you can get 80% lending, only having to put 20% in. There are some variants of that. In fact, I just got told the other day in some cases you can put less than that in. Sometimes you have to put 30% in on that. So I see that as one of the advantages right now, and really why we've created this video. Any comments on that there, Matthew? Yeah.
Well, Reserve Bank obviously wanting to ice down the Auckland property market and the wider property market nationally, brought in 60% LVRs. And they widened them to be New Zealand wide, so rather than being a regional restriction on Auckland, they became a national restriction. So it's made it very difficult for people who want to inflate, larger property portfolios. And of course, if you're buying new builds, you mentioned it before, it's such an advantage that you get 80% finance on a new build. Even if it's an investment property, you still get the 80% LVR. So you're only having to put down a 20% deposit as opposed to second-hand housing stock, which is going to be a 40% deposit.
Yeah, on a $600,000 buy, obviously 120 versus 240, big difference, especially if you're a newbie investor or
massive difference. Yeah, and incidentally, something I've seen a lot of new investors, they seem to be doing it. I can't endorse this, of course, but I've observed them doing it. People will buy a new build on a 90% loan or something of that nature to buy it as their family home.
Yep.
So they get their first home, and I've noticed it's a bit of a recurring trend where they'll live in that house for a while and then move out and with a different bank buy a second home. And with that second bank, they can get 10% deposits, 90% finance, and their existing house with the other bank can sit there 90% geared. And that seems to be very common at the moment.
That is.
So
I think it's two properties you can actually buy as your own home, I believe, with 90%.
Right. Well, that's
something to talk about your mortgage broker about.
It is, yeah, and I think that's slightly different again. I think I'm just talking about people gaming the rules.
Right. Yeah.
Because of course you can have a batch, a holiday home.
Yeah.
But I'm not saying do it. I'm just smiling, saying I'm observing it being done.
No, definitely people doing that right as we speak.
They seem to buy a new home every year and leave the other one with their first bank 90% geared. So they're effectively getting 90% finance.
Yeah, and if you're unsure about that or don't quite understand, email us or talk to your mortgage broker
Go to a mortgage broker.
that. Yeah. So that's all good. So the 20%, and it's 20%, it can actually be slightly more or less you have to put into a new build, depending on what it is and depending on your situation. I've been told by Chris Peterson Mortgages the other day, a mortgage broker.
Another thing I like about new builds is there's normally a delayed settlement element to them, so it's typically 5 to 8 months to build a house, and if the developer's early stage getting resource consents, it could be 12 to 24 months before the house is actually delivered.
Yep.
So if you're investing in an area that's in a rising market, for example, at the moment Wellington's in a rising market, Queenstown's in a rising market at the time this video is being shot, and Auckland's cooling off, So if you do off the plans new builds in those rising markets, you set your price now, maybe a 5% deposit, and as the market goes up, you get all of that increase in value between signing the contract and settlement, and that can assist you with your finance.
And of course, you've only for a deposit, you only have to put 10% in when you sign the contract. So if you've only put 60,000 in for a $600,000 property, it rises by at least that or more.
Of course, the counterpoint is if the market turns around, it goes down, you're then suffering that loss.
And that's one of the things to be aware of. And as you said, you look at what market you're in, and Wellington, Queenstown, for example, still going quite okay at the moment. When at the height of the market, you just have to be a wee bit more careful, or see, are you buying market value or are you buying slightly under market value? Some areas of New Zealand you can buy under market value for an off-the-plan build. That takes a lot of the risk out, of course, of that.
Yeah, and it's all about timing, isn't it? Auckland tends to boom first, and then the regions, the other main centres boom second, and then it ripples out to the regions. And it's pretty random, it seems, but the one thing that is true of all property cycles is Auckland kicks off first and goes up the fastest, becomes really unaffordable, and because it's so unaffordable, people get pushed out of Auckland, so they start moving to the regions. So that ripple effect then puts inflation into the regions. So that means maybe Auckland's peaked now. It's not the best time to buy Auckland off the plans, but certainly there's, I think, opportunity in places like Queenstown and Wellington, which are further behind.
And of course, if you do get that 10% growth or whatever while you're waiting, whether it's 6 months or 2 years for your new build to be completed, I guess at nearer the time it gives you choice, because especially if it's 2 years, circumstances change. If you've made 10%, you can either, if you did want to sell, and you have to still pay tax on that, of course, if you did, there's an opportunity there to make some money. Or if it has risen 10%, well, that's great. You've 10% less deposit you have to pay when you actually settle the property. So that you can turn that back around.
And you need to keep your eye on tax there, because if your intention is to sell, you'll have to pay income tax. And if you continuously and regularly do that, you'll have to pay GST. And paying GST is fraught with risk, because if the vendor to you is GST registered and you are deemed to be GST registered because your intention is to sell and you do it on multiple occasions, then of course when you sell you want to claim GST and pay GST and just pay GST on the difference. But if you're registered and the vendor's registered, then you're deemed zero rated. So if you've paid $1 million for it, including GST, that actually means $1 million plus GST.
Yes, so my advice on that will be, if the vendor, the developer's always going to be GST registered. So if you are GST registered and you are trading a property, make sure that you
take advice.
Talk to the agent, or talk to us, or talk to your accountant about the what can go wrong with that, because it can severely go wrong. But if you're a developer, you should know that. I've had clients brought 4 or 5 new builds from me, from apartments to standalone townhouses all around the country. She's from New Plymouth, and she just buys new builds, and she banks on getting that 10% growth. In some cases, she's had more than that for one she's bought from us, and she's there. She keeps it. That's what she does. She gets appreciation. She does.
So there's zero risk tax wise in that. But we've seen some interesting examples at Gilligan Row where people have been buying a house off the plans, selling it, and that in itself, if you did it once and it was a genuine change of intention and the bright line rules didn't apply because you settled after 2 years, that would wash with IRD. But we meet taxpayers who come to us with problems when they're fighting with IRD, who have perhaps done that 4 or 5 times, and IRD will come in and they'll say, look at this, in the last 4 years you've had 5 properties, you seem to buy them and turn them over. Before the bright line rules we couldn't see you, now we can see you, and we've investigated you more thoroughly and we've found these 5 transactions. And so what they do, Mark, is they go back to the beginning and they say, right back at the beginning, you're deemed to be GST registered. And then they say, well, okay, for that first transaction that you paid, by example, $1 million for it, you want to claim 130,000 GST out of it, and we see you sold it, say, for, I don't know, 1.1 million. So say they want to pay GST on 1.1, claim GST on 1, the difference is 100 grand, they should be paying GST effectively of about 13,000 on the difference. But because the vendor is GST registered to you, and you're deemed to be GST registered retrospectively, the IRD say, we say you should have been registered, then that transaction becomes deemed zero rated. And what that means is, including GST of 1 million means 1 million plus GST effectively. You don't get to claim GST on it. So when you sell for 1.1, you have to pay GST on 1.1, which is 130 plus 143, near enough, 143,000, and you don't get to claim GST. So you'd actually lose 143,000
Absolutely.
just off the GST. And so deemed retrospective registration is very dangerous if you are a person dabbling in buying and selling. Be careful there.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's one of the reasons we've got Matthew here to talk about, as I said, things to be aware of and the advantages of it.
Yeah, just be
But
really
if
careful with
you're an
tax.
investor and you're going to buy, you're buying one of these, a new build to keep forever and ever, hey, you're okay. But as soon as you do start trading now or in the future, as Matthew said, you have to be very aware.
On a positive note, of course, with new builds, you've got generally an identifiable larger chattel component.
Yes, yeah.
Carpets, curtains, heat pumps, stoves, that sort of stuff. And you can identify that.
I'll add on to that, as well as the chattels, if you buy quite often a new apartment off the plans, might be a furnished apartment, there might be $20,000, $30,000 worth of furniture.
Yes.
That can also be...
So you get to depreciate this. So whereas building depreciation's now zero, and land, of course, has always been zero. So if you just buy a second-hand house and you don't have any chattels, you don't get any tax benefit from the chattels. And you could do a chattel valuation and get one on a second-hand house, but most people don't, and they don't value up that well. For a new house, you can actually say, well, that heat pump was $6,000, that carpet was $6,000, stove was $2,000. It all adds up very quickly, and you get a decent tax benefit from that. So a new build does have that advantage.
Yeah, we've got example one in Queenstown, we're just about to list, I think it's $28,000 depreciation the first year. Obviously, it's a very short-lived period of time. The depreciation goes for three years, is it, or 4 years?
Depends on the asset.
Yeah, it depends on the asset,
Yeah.
on what they are. But I consider that to be a really, if you use the money wisely, that's a very big part of new builds right now. If you're getting $5,000 or $10,000 or $15,000 back that first year and $8,000 the second and $4,000 the third year, you can squander that money, or you can put it into another property, or you can actually pay it off against the debt. And if you pay that, that gives you more equity in the property, gives you a more safety margin, enables you to buy something else if you want to, and at the same time your cash flow becomes better because you owe less debt, you're getting the same cash flow. So it all depends on, there's been so many ways to teach how to do property in the last 10 years. It used to be leverage 100% and never pay debt off, and a lot of people got caught out there within the last 10 years. So if you can pay debt off with that depreciation the first 4 years, and when you buy an investment property, you should have a maintenance plan, and it might be $2,000 a year towards a maintenance or whatever it might be, which is a good safety margin to have. You always need to do maintenance on an older property in particular. If you go, hey, I've got a new property for the first 3 or 4 years, there's going to be very little maintenance, again, allocate that money somewhere and put it again on the principal. If you do that for 4 years,
you can borrow
you've
it
got
back.
a massive head start, haven't you, Matthew, if that's the case?
Yeah, you can borrow it back. It's just good commercial sense, isn't it, to do that?
Something I never got taught when I first went to Property 101 years ago, 15 years ago.
I don't touch any of the cash flow coming off my rents. My rent roll at the moment is about 1.1, so I've got a decent decent rent roll coming in, and it's well positive cash flow. I don't touch any of it. I just drive it back into debt.
Yes,
because people get paranoid about paying off debt. You reduce the debt. When you see another investment that you want to make, you go to the bank and borrow the money back. They'll give you the money. Banks don't take the money and run. They'll say, oh, well done, you're reducing principal, you've got surplus cash. Yeah. And if you put that in the bank, you're getting very low interest rate on it. If you reduce debt, then your reduction of cost is your cost of funds, which is higher than the amount that you would receive. So I think that's smart. Listen, just another thing I've noticed, a few dodgy developers, I'd describe them as, around, and I've seen clients getting caught in transactions where they're basically buying off the plans in areas that are overcapitalised, or the developers don't seem to complete the developments because they run out of finance, or they just, for whatever reason, decide not to do the development.
Yep.
What advice would you give to an investor there?
Yeah, well, my first point I already got to things to be aware of. We talked about some of the benefits financially and what you can actually gain from doing it and paying less money out, and all the good practices we sort of spoke about. But yeah, one of the biggest things, and I've had personal experience with this, with good and bad, is look at a developer's experience. If you think yourself, if you're out there now and you've done a small renovation, for example, maybe you've done 5 renovations or 5 developments or whatever you may have done, what's happened during those 5 renovations? You've improved every single time. You now look for better property, you now look for better location, you now look for better facilities around the area, schooling and infrastructure and what have you, and you get better with the figures. So if you use a developer, I personally had a very bad experience about 12 years ago when I was a little less experienced, and it was with a developer with no experience at all, and I went and brought off the plan. So there's various things that happen with that, but of course, as I said, if you must go with an experienced developer, so do a bit of research on the developer or what they have done. Is this their first one ever? Be careful. So yeah, that's what I'd say. I mean,
and how do you protect yourself against a developer, say, sitting there indefinitely and not doing anything?
Yeah, and that's one of the things where I did get, 2 things I still could have got out of it after this, but I didn't. I hadn't met anyone like yourself to get me out of the situation I had back then. But what you can do is you have a thing called a sunset clause, and if anyone buys an off-the-plan build, you must 100% have a sunset clause. Sunset clause is the schedule of the development is to finish in 1 September this year. So 1 September they're saying it should finish. There are always hold-ups, no matter how good the developer is, whether it's through the council or subbies, there's always pushes back.
I think those sunset clauses say they've got to break ground and meet certain milestones, don't they?
So they do.
So if they have triggered those, then it's fair enough. You know that it's real and you can see settlements coming. But if you get 18 months, 24 months down the track,
the market's turned. You're buying a place worth $400,000 or $600,000 is now only worth $550.
Yeah.
And it's taken 18 months longer to build, as Matthew just said.
Yeah.
You have to settle this property, so you're up for lose. You're going to buy the property and lose
50 grand
straight away.
Yeah.
Not a good look. And I've experienced this, and again, inexperienced developer didn't have it. A good developer will always have a sunset clause anyway.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be a month after the schedule finish. It will be 6 months to 18 months to a year to 2, depending on the development size, depending on how far away.
Yeah, it protects both parties, because if something's going wrong with the developer, everyone needs to get out.
Yep.
And if the developer's dragging the chain and acting inappropriately for whatever reason, you've got the ability to terminate the contract and run and get your deposit back, because he hasn't started the development and broken ground effectively.
Or you can still carry on if you want to. So it gives you, the buyer, the choice. So it goes forever, and you go, this is not what we signed up for. You can, as Matthew said, you can cancel the contract, get your full deposit back, carry on, or you can go, hey, I'll hang around for a wee bit longer. It's not that far away. We've made good money while we've been waiting. And so sunset clause, 100%, make sure it's on the contract. Finance has got particularly hard. You might know more about this than me, Matthew. And it used to be you could sign up a 2-year off the plan deal and you knew you'd get finance 2 years down the track. Not quite like that at the moment.
Yeah, there's a lot of credit rationing going on.
Talk about the banks. Why is this happening? Why are the banks not lending how they were 2 years ago?
Yeah, well, there's capital adequacy ratios on the banks themselves. The banks are now having to operate as effectively independent subsidiaries. They used to be able to get a loan from their from their head office, and that would count as capital. But now the banks have got to be, the individual branches in New Zealand have to make certain balance sheet tests to be allowed to do business in New Zealand, or they face penalties with the Reserve Bank. So that requires, instead of a loan from the parent, capital to be introduced, so that if the bank becomes insolvent, that money that the banks put in as capital gets burnt before the deposit holders get burnt. So those capital adequacy ratios are burning banks, because there are new requirements that are biting particularly this year forwards for the banks. So that's required more liquidity, more money to be put in by the banks, at a time when the big banks in New Zealand, which have Australian parents, are under pressure in Australia because they've got some development finance settlement failure going on over there. A lot of the Aussie property has been sold to Chinese investors. Chinese investors can't get cash out of China at the moment, and there's no foreign buyer finance. So there's apartments and developments have been done assuming that the Chinese can bring money to Australia and then borrow locally on whatever the ratio was. But neither of those things are true. Suddenly they can't get money out, they can't borrow and get foreign buyers finance.
And unfortunately, in hindsight, that's then affecting our lending in New Zealand. Because
so Australia's suddenly
relationship with
got this
Australian
wall
banks.
of settlement failure, which means that capital is not released back into the banking system to flow into New Zealand for new builds. So you're seeing the developers in Auckland, a lot of developments getting put on hold or cancelled. It's been prominent in the press this year in 2017, and that's why, because there's actually credit rationing going on for property development finance. And at the investor level, 60% LVRs, tighter market, flattening market, more conservatism from the banks and pressure on their balance sheets from capital adequacy ratios, all of that's leading to a tighter finance market. Yeah.
So if you're in the market too...
Not a bad thing though, because Auckland was just silly high.
Oh,
we were hitting
absolutely.
$1 million and we'd sort of...
This is what's kept the market at compared to 10 years ago, the property market where it had a big crash. It's probably saving the big crash this time around
But we didn't have a big crash because, Auckland didn't. Auckland went down 4%, and if you went into the regions that crashed hard, well, they crashed hard for a reason, because they were speculating and inflating asset values in areas with bad fundamentals.
Yeah.
No population growth, loose supply, poor employment fundamentals. Those areas are always going to crash. They'll crash again this cycle if interest rates spike.
Yeah, another story another day. Listen to our podcast where we've spoken about that before.
Yes, so stay in the areas with best employment fundamentals, tight supply.
Yeah.
And Auckland went down 4% last cycle to the bottom of the GFC. If you take a rolling 90-day average of quarterly medians, which is what I'm talking about here, we went down 4% on a rolling 90-day average, which was spectacularly low volatility. We lacked volatility in Auckland, whereas some areas in Whangarei, for example,
40% on a
40 plus, 50% plus, the investor parts of Whangarei, and a lot of small towns through New Zealand experienced that volatility. So if you're going to do this new build off the plans, do it in good areas, don't do it in dodgy areas.
Yeah, do it in good areas and on the personal level. See a mortgage broker that understands new builds too. Don't see a bank or a mortgage broker that doesn't really deal with new builds, because you only have your finance for so long, and you have to know how long that is. And you have to look at your own personal situation as your wife about you're going to start a family in the next wee while, and things will change. So talk to a mortgage broker that will tell you and inform you of where it is, and it'll alleviate some of those personal problems and issues sort of coming up.
Oh, good.
So that's just a wee introduction. What we've you've just those who are listening to this, if this is fresh on the page, we've got our new page now for Property Ventures on new builds. We don't want to throw any old property on that page that every other man and his dog's got. Yes, sometimes there will be a double up with other agencies, but we want to put product that are on there. If every investor's coming from a different angle, what they're trying to achieve, capital gains, cash flow, whatever it might be, long term versus short term. But what we want to do, if we want to put a property on there that will suit one of those criteria, if it's something that we just think there's issues or problems with it, and who am I to really judge, but I want good properties on our site. We're not going to put Joe average properties out there if we can help it. We're not mind readers in the future.
Yeah.
But
what you're saying is you're selecting the better stock for the market.
Yeah. And we have got a couple sources of how we get new property, but we only want to put the cream of the cream on there. We deal with our investors like this every day of the week through our podcast and video series. We want to keep that relationship going positively, and hopefully we can do that by having good property.
Yeah, and also you're pre-selecting developers that are reputable, that actually do perform, that have a track record.
Had personal history, Matthew, of developments not going, or new builds not going well by inexperienced developers, and we don't want to. I don't want to pass it on to my buyers. Why would I?
I've had them. 12, 13 years ago, I bought a house, basically 100 apartments in Simon's Hobson Street, 188 Hobson Street, and my idea was buy the 100 apartments, flick on 90, keep 10, pay the tax on the profit on the 90, but bought them wholesale, sold them, semi-retail, and the margin off the 90 that I sold, I would put into the 10 that I kept. So I did this with a mate, and we worked very hard. It was a lot of work, and we actually sold something like 85 of the apartments and ended up with 15 unsold. So we were very happy, and we had a nice margin, there was a bit for the investor, a bit for us. So having done everything, deposits paid, all the legal work done, paid for all of that, and we were waiting patiently, the developer cancelled the contract and started a new company, moved it across and developed it in the new company. Why did he do that? Because the assets, the values of the apartments went up significantly, and our investors who bought them off us were getting the benefit of that, so it was a win-win in our group, but they just wanted to pinch the development off us, so they cancelled it and moved it to another company. And they actually were good enough to pay us out some commission. They took about 10 contracts, but they cancelled the rest, and it cost us a lot of money and wasted our time. So
that's why you go with a company that, because there were stories of companies like that out there doing that.
I know that developers, I'll never buy or deal with them again.
So we like to take some of the guesswork out by pre-selecting developers that we know are equitable, good operators and work well. So
yeah.
So anything parting words, Matthew, and I'll.
I think 2017 is an election year. Election year is always a flat year for property. As we get closer to the election, people will be scared, and they'll be scared that there'll be tax changes if Labor gets in, capital gains tax, that sort of stuff, and just potential change of government always scares the market. So as that fear and uncertainty comes into the market, it's actually a really good buying opportunity that comes out of it, because nothing has changed fundamentally. Auckland still has a supply problem. Nobody's building at the moment because you can't get development finance, so Auckland's still a great place to invest, but you have to choose carefully. You have to get wholesale stuff, and you can actually get wholesale stuff when people are fearful. I think we're heading into that market. I'm seeing really good buys around, and I've started buying again. Rest of the country still cycling behind. Some areas not so much. Some areas are closer to Auckland's growth. So if I was leaving Auckland for new builds, I would be into the areas that are cycling further back. In other words, they haven't had the lift, because historically they've actually caught up. Ripple effect catches them up.
Yep.
So that would be Wellington, would be first choice, Hamilton second choice, Queenstown just because it's so tight for supply. Having said that, Queenstown is a boom bust town. So.
Has been in the past, but one story about Queenstown, 10 years ago, it was when the last cycle peaked, it was a winter destination, holiday destination. Moved forward 10, 12 years, it's now a all-year-round destination.
It is, yeah, it is.
And it's changing. We heard of the airports looking to be extended and direct flights to China in the next 2 to 5 years. How good is that going to be?
China is going to drive New Zealand, no question. Yeah.
Anyway, again,
it's exciting for investors. Yeah.
Absolutely exciting.
Yeah.
So thank you for listening to the video today. I hope it's helped you. Any queries you have, we're always free to answer anything you may send to us at info@propertyventures.co.nz. And apart from that, have a wonderful day and happy investing.
Thanks for listening.